50 years ago, on October 21, 1967, an estimated 100,000 Vietnam War protesters gathered at the Lincoln Memorial for a rally and then marched to the Pentagon. Led by social activist Abby Hoffman, more than 600 protesters were arrested, including Norman Mailer, who would later win a Pulitzer Prize for his book on the march, The Armies of the Night. Up next on Real America, from January of 1968, the Vietnam War, How Much Dissent. This half-hour episode of a weekly series, ABC Scope, examines resistance to the war and the draft, with footage of demonstrations, interviews with those in support and opposition to the war, and portions of a press conference by President Lyndon Johnson.
They raise their voices, their placards, and they march against the government. Most dissenters in the Vietnam War confine themselves to this kind of protest activity. But some go farther, burning selective service cards and obstructing the draft, flying Viet Cong banners and burning the American flag. During large demonstrations, hundreds of protesters are sometimes arrested. Which activities fall within the bounds of lawful, justified dissent, and which go beyond the limits to become lawless and perhaps rebellion?
ABC Scope, the wide world of people and events. This week, the Vietnam War, Part 107. How Much Dissent? Here with that story is ABC correspondent John Scali.
Hardly a day goes by without a new report of another demonstration or protest against the Vietnam War. And hardly a day passes when those who support the war don't wonder how much dissent is too much. Those who oppose it ask themselves, how far can they go in expressing this opposition? The question, how much dissent, is as old as Socrates and his assertion of the priority of individual conscience over the laws of the state. It is as familiar as the opinion of Oliver Wendell Holmes that the right of free speech does not give one the right to shout a false warning of fire in a crowded theater. It is as current as the controversy over General Hershey or the indictments of Dr. Spock and Reverend Coffin. We'll address ourselves to this important question on our report this week.
John Scali will return with our story when ABC Scope continues in just 1 minute.
Outside the Justice Department in Washington on October 20th, Dr. Benjamin Spock and the Reverend William Sloane Coffin, chaplain of Yale University, urged young men to turn in their draft cards. Reverend Coffin collected some cards and brought them to the Justice Department himself. Indictments handed down earlier this month charged Coffin, Spock, and 3 others with conspiring to counsel and aid young men to evade the draft. Justice Department spokesmen insist the indictments do not foreshadow a general crackdown on dissenters, but are rather an attempt to stop serious violations of the law. This was Reverend Coffin's reaction.
We welcome the indictment because what we want to do, and hopefully we'll be able to do it, is to try to demonstrate to the country that many aspects of the war, many aspects of the draft law are really unconstitutional. I'm very disturbed to get letters from people who say, how can you, a Christian minister, oppose the law of the land? And these people seem to forget that one, from a religious perspective, never surrenders one's conscience to the state. It goes through the entire Bible. We must obey God rather than men, which means that one's conscience is never surrendered to the state. Our Puritan forefathers came to this country because they were dedicated to the notion that you don't surrender your conscience to the state. Jesus was officially tagged with treason. He disobeyed not only the civil law, but the holy law. Peter and Paul were in and out of jail all the time. From a religious point of view, it seems to me you say 3 things about law. 1, that it's good. Without it, creation would be chaos. 2, that laws, like individuals, can fall. And therefore, that 3, one must always strive to see that the law reflects and doesn't reject one's best notions of justice, which means, therefore, that one is always trying to improve the law, which means, therefore, that one has respect for what's legal, but is more concerned with what is right. Now, it's very important, though, to remember that this isn't to advocate anarchy. This isn't to advocate revolution. If we're willing to accept the legal punishment, then we are, in fact, supporting and not subverting the legal order. And you cannot say that somebody who is engaged in civil disobedience is automatically trying to destroy the whole legal order as an anarchist or a revolutionary. Now, if he is a revolutionary, as Adams, Jefferson, and others were, then he's out to destroy the whole order. But I'm not nearly as radical as Jefferson. You know, it always hurts a little bit to be called unpatriotic. I was a captain, an airborne, World War II, stayed over a little extra to volunteer a little extra in the Army. Then I was 3 years in the Central Intelligence Agency. Did nothing under top secret for 3 years. And I always felt that I was trying my best to serve my country. I just don't think one serves one's country by asking good men to die bravely in a bad cause.
How are the nation and the government tolerating the Vietnam dissenters as compared with the situation in past wars? We talked to the head of an organization dedicated to defending the rights of dissenters, John Pemberton of the American Civil Liberties Union.
I think the climate in the country with respect to the toleration of dissent is better in this war than it probably has been in any predecessor war. This does not mean that the climate isn't showing some increasing hostility to dissent. Well, I think what is unique about this war is that it is a very unpopular war, perhaps the most unpopular in certainly recent history. And the expressions of dissent on the part of government officials themselves have tended to create an area in which government has had to tolerate dissent.
Melvin Wolfe, legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union.
If you'd asked me how the government was behaving itself in the face of dissent, if you'd asked me that question about 2 weeks ago, I would have said that with certain notorious exceptions, General Hershey, for example, and his punitive selective service policy, that by and large the federal government was behaving itself quite well. But the indictments of Dr. Spock and Reverend Coffin and the other three individuals marks off a very critical change of behavior by the government. They have, if you will, lost their cool. I think that they have been reached by the criticism, been affected by it, been injured by it, which is the purpose of criticism of governmental action in a free society. If it's not effective speech, then it really doesn't serve its full purpose.
ABC's Bob Clark asked Senator Gale McGee, a strong administration supporter on Vietnam, his views of one of the general questions raised by the indictment.
Do Americans who believe the war is immoral have the right to preach resistance against the draft?
I think that the question of morality in this war has to accommodate itself to the concepts of majority rule in a democracy. We have a place, for example, for conscientious objectors, and we have a place for those who are immediately subject to draft, where they can make peace with their conscience. And in terms of a man of God, to place his judgment of morality above and beyond that of the majority, I would think would be a bit presumptuous. I'm afraid that the tendency on the part of so many who would inject morality is to try to get the Lord on their side, or to pretend that they happen to have a monopoly on what the Lord would do in Vietnam. And I would hope that they would all remember a little retreat on that line that Abraham Lincoln resorted to when he said, "All I hope is that I'm on the Lord's side."
Of course, I don't want to pass on the guilt or innocence of anyone, because they have a right to be heard in court. That's part of the American system. But generally, people who do such advocating ought to be dealt with, and they ought to be stuck under a jail. I'm not talking about these particular cases because I don't know the facts involved, but anyone who, as a matter of fact, advocates the burning of draft cards, that advocates and conspires to advocate the disobedience of the law, they ought to be punished. You see, we people in our part of the country have heard these pseudo-intellectuals on some of these college campuses always say, you Southern folks ought to obey the law, and we do obey the law whether we like it or not. Now this same element are today advocating the disobedience of unjust laws, and that's the reason today we have anarchy conditions in our country.
David McReynolds, Field Secretary of the War Resisters League, a pacifist group.
Well, this may sound old-fashioned or square or patriotic. I think that Dr. Spock was greatly honored by the indictment, and I would be enormously honored to be among those indicted, because I think it's an honor to be indicted for the defense of the Republic, in fact, the defense of the nation, against a president who has usurped powers that are not his under the Constitution, who has involved us in war without a declaration of war, and who has violated his campaign pledges.
General Lewis Hershey, the crusty 74-year-old head of Selective Service, is the storm center of a second controversy involving dissenters in the draft. Hershey has told draft boards across the country to take away the deferments of registrants who take actions interfering with Selective Service procedures. When these students staged a sit-in at a draft board in Ann Arbor, Michigan in October 1965, the general ordered some of them inducted. The courts have since held the action unconstitutional, but that hasn't changed the general's tactics. He explained his position to ABC's Dan Hackle.
One of the problems we got up against was having individuals, not only students, but fathers and apprentices and farmers, that were being deferred, and at the same time were attempting to interfere with force or violence or threat with the operations system. And I don't know, the logic is a little awkward when you defer people to violate the law.
Well, is that why they were deferred?
Well, no, they were deferred for instance, a student. But whether he was using it as a clinical study in some of his laboratory work to go out and disobey the law, or whether he was moonlighting to do it, seemed rather immaterial, because it is inconsistent with the federal government deferring a fellow in national interest to have him attacking the national interest by doing acts which come under the violations of the law. I do want to make it quite clear that a deferment is not anything but a civil action, and therefore when a board, first of all, you don't get a deferment unless somebody gives it to you, and the only people that can give it to you is the local board. And therefore the local board has the responsibility of seeing that the individual who got the deferment lives up to the implied contract, and you can't certainly defer anybody unless you expect them to obey the laws that they're being deferred under.
Your critics say that you're stifling dissent in this country.
Well, I know that. And if it stifles dissent to get people to obey the laws, I'm guilty. If it's stifling consent to make a person do what they're supposed to and that the Congress says they have to do, if that's dissent, I got to plead guilty.
What Hershey has done is to substitute the Selective Service Boards for the courts. He says that Selective Service Boards are empowered to determine where crimes have been committed. Now, this is nonsense. The only bodies in the United States which can determine whether crimes are committed are the courts.
Well, those who criticize General Hershey, I don't put much stock in anything they say. In the first place, they are some of these who are advocating the victory of the communists. Many of them are doing that. Many of them are advocating the right to make speeches in favor of the communists under the guise of academic freedom. So I would say that this great American, patriotic American, if I have to resolve any doubts, they'll be resolved in favor of General Hershey and not in favor of this liberal left-wing pseudo crowd who stalk around in the streets barefooted.
I think General Hershey ought to be retired. It seems to me that the moment you inject punitive aspects to selective service, that it becomes a self-defeating operation. I don't believe that the general has the right to inject that. I don't believe that ought to be the basis of any selective service system, that it becomes a kind of a penal service as a punishment for some law that you may have broken.
We'll hear the views of President Johnson and some of his critics when ABC Scope continues in just 1 minute.
One of the largest peace demonstrations in history was held last October in Washington. More than 50,000 persons took part, and thousands of them marched on the Pentagon to protest the war. A leader of that demonstration was Jerry Rubin, a radical activist of the so-called New Left. We recently asked him his view of the limits of dissent.
We're living in the middle of a beast. Lyndon Johnson is a common murderer, and he should be arrested for murder. There are no limits to dissent. I think the peace movement should have the anger of a Vietnamese woman whose child was burned by napalm, dropped by American planes, way up there in the sky. That's the anger the peace movement should reflect. The peace movement's got to go into the streets, and it's got to use the tactic of disruption, because the American people are drunk with apathy, because they don't care. Our country is now in the situation that Germany was in the 40s. We're committing mass murder. We're lawless. And the only people that can save this country are the people who recognize this and are willing to risk their lives to go out in the streets and stop this country from its murder.
Some more moderate critics of Vietnam policy, like Senator Mark Hatfield, charge advocates of the war with failing to distinguish between responsible and irresponsible dissent. Hatfield talked to Bob Clark.
There is a tendency to create the impression that if you aren't for President Johnson, LBJ, on one hand, then you must be for Ho Chi Minh on the other hand. This great polarization, this simplistic approach, that you're either for us or against us as Americans. You either line up with the president and his policy, or you line up with the communists, or you undermine the boys in Vietnam. This is, I think, very dangerous, because there is responsible dissent that attempts to point out the weaknesses and the fallacies of the present policy and offer alternatives. And they are different and should be differentiated from those who are burning the flag, burning the draft cards, creating riotous situations in our communities under the guise of dissent. They should not be lumped together. And this is one of the problems that we face as dissenters.
Do you think President Johnson himself has been guilty of some of this intolerance toward dissenters?
I think so. I think he's been talking out of both sides of his mouth. I think he's spoken in terms of saying that there is a right of dissent, but by the same token, he's given the very definite impression through language and through illusions of other kinds that if you do not support his policy, it's costing lives in Vietnam. It's destroying the morale of our boys in Vietnam. It's giving aid and comfort to the enemy in Vietnam. Now, to me, this totally contradicts his previous statement that there is a role for dissent, because by these words, by these actions, he is so negating the possibility of dissent that it's almost destroying dissent.
President Johnson was asked about this kind of criticism at his news conference November 17th.
No, I haven't called anyone unpatriotic. I haven't said anything that would indicate that. I think the wicked fleeth when no one pursueth sometimes. I do think that some people are irresponsible and make untrue statements and ought to be cautious and careful when they're dealing with a problem involving their men at the front. There's a great deal of difference between criticism and difference and responsible dissent, all of which we insist on and all of which we protect. And stormtrooper bullying of throwing yourself down the road and smashing windows and rowdyism, and every time a person attempts to speak to try to drown him out. We believe very strongly in preserving the right to differ in this country and the right to dissent. And if I have done a good job of anything since I've been president, is to ensure that there are plenty of dissenters. What I'm trying to do is to preserve my right to give the other side. I don't think one side ought to dominate the whole picture. So what I would say is, let's realize that we're in the midst of a war. Let's realize that there are 500,000 of our boys out there that are giving their life to win that war. Let's ask ourselves what it is we can do to help. And if you think that you can make a contribution to helping them by expressing your opinion and dissenting, then do it. But then if the Secretary of State starts to explain his viewpoint Don't send out instructions all over the country and say, when he starts to talk and says, Mr. Chairman, wrap your feet. We know that most people's intentions are good. We don't question their motives. We've never said they're unpatriotic, although they say some pretty ugly things about us. And people that live in glass houses shouldn't be too anxious to throw stones.
Governor Wallace, speaking in Akron, Ohio last month, gave his views on the limitations of dissent.
Students who raise money and blood and clothes for the Viet Cong communists, send it overseas to help use against American servicemen, and those who speak and call for the victory of the communists in the name of academic freedom are giving morale support and are aiding and abetting the enemy in Hanoi, Peking, and Moscow. And if I were the president, the first thing I would do is have my attorney general drag some of these bearded professors making such speeches before a grand jury and indict them and send them off to the penitentiary for what they are, traitors, because they are traitors. I'm not talking about honest dissent. Many good people in this audience probably, and throughout the country, honestly dissent about our being in Vietnam because you love our country. And maybe you think we shouldn't be there because it's not in our interest to be there, and you're honest in it. And many members of the Congress feel the same way. But there's a difference between honest dissent and overt acts of treason and aid and comfort to the enemy.
How has the Supreme Court ruled on the limits of dissent in wartime? Bob Clark talked to an authority on the First Amendment, Yale Law School professor Thomas Emerson.
What are the chief legal precedents in past wars in this area of the right to dissent and to protest the actions of the government, including the draft?
Well, there were several cases that rose out of the First World War. The leading case was the Schenck case. Schenck was General Secretary of the Socialist Party, and he issued a pamphlet which denounced conscription, as they called it at that time, and urged people to assert their rights in opposition to the draft. He was indicted for obstructing recruitment in the armed services and was convicted. On appeal, the Supreme Court's decision was written by Justice Holmes. Justice Holmes started off by saying that the First Amendment could not possibly protect all speech, that it would not protect the person falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater, and that therefore there must be some limitation. And he devised the limitation of the clear and present danger test and upheld the conviction.
How about the more recent court cases directly involving the Vietnam War?
Well, there's only one that really directly involves the Vietnam War, and that was the case of Julian Bond. Julian Bond had been refused his seat in the Georgia legislature because of certain statements that he had made or endorsed. And the question was whether or not those statements were protected under the First Amendment. The main statement was one issued by SNCC, in which they had said that we are in sympathy with and support the men in this country who are unwilling to respond to the military draft. The Supreme Court held that statement was protected by the First Amendment. And I would say that is the basis for my suggestion that the Schenck case and the Debs case would not be followed today. The court also held that that statement did not violate the Selective Service Act, that it was too ambiguous, not specific enough, and that then poses a question that would be before the court in some cases which may reach them later.
John Scali will return with the final comment in just 1 minute.
Each of those we have heard on this program, from Governor Wallace on one end of the spectrum to Jerry Rubin on the other, agrees on the value and importance of dissent. But each has his own idea of where the line should be drawn between what is permissible and what is not. At the risk of adding still one more opinion, let me sum up by telling you what I think. I think first that we should not only tolerate but listen to the voices of dissent. Much of the present outcry against the Vietnam War comes from the very young who are genuinely troubled caught between the demands of society and the dictates of their individual conscience. If they believe the Vietnam War is illegal and immoral, they have a right to protest, to seek to change that policy, provided that they stay within the legal framework of the society whose comforts and protection they otherwise accept. But when they resort to overt acts, such as blocking induction centers, collecting draft cards, or refusing themselves to be drafted, they are on very dangerous grounds. They are then not only violating the rights of others, but they are challenging the very existence of an orderly society. If you feel so strongly in the rightness of your cause that you are ready to pay the penalty the law imposes if convicted, then you deserve some sympathy and respect. But if you resort to violence and illegal acts, then seek to escape the consequences, you are saying our society isn't worth saving, and you are contributing to anarchy. The late Justice Holmes once defined the limits of dissent by declaring, "My right to wave my arm ends where your nose begins." To me, that means you can say what you please, but doing what you please is something else again. This is John Scali in Washington.
This has been ABC Scope, the Vietnam War, Part 107, How Much Dissent? Join us again next week at this time over many of these same ABC stations when ABC Scope will present a program examining the state of the Republican Party 10 months before the election. John Causier speaking. This has been a presentation of ABC News.